Since 2022, global defence spending has surged at a rate not seen since the 1980s. Russia led the way, switching over to a wartime economy to support its invasion of Ukraine, while European nations eventually answered the emerging threat by shaking off decades of peace dividend spending levels and becoming the focal point, along with Ukraine, of the spending jumps we saw in 2024. Meanwhile, over in Asia, defence spending by the People's Republic of China has grown rapidly and consistently. Going into 2025, though, it wasn't entirely clear whether or not the United States would be following the same path. Earlier this week, though, we might have got our answer, with the heads of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee agreeing on a $150 billion package, which they hope will be added to the existing fiscal year 2025 budget. In terms of sheer scale, depending on the exchange rate you go with, we are talking about the United States increasing its defence spending by about the level of official Russian defence spending. And so having gone through all 250 plus spending items in this particular proposal, today I want to crack it open and ask a couple of questions. What's there? Why does it matter? And critically, what might it tell us about the kind of wars and conflicts the US expects its military to have to deter, and if necessary, win? To do that, I'll actually start with some of the big picture findings, looking at the scale, the content, and what it potentially signals at a high level. Then we'll start digging through some of the major investment areas: the Navy and shipbuilding, munitions investment, air superiority, US nuclear forces investments, and some of the other items around things like readiness, research and development, and the strategic concepts they point towards. Then towards the end, I'll go through a number of things that appear to be absent or underrepresented in this package, as well as some of the risks and questions that might stand in the way of it achieving its intended results. A note up front is that one of the biggest funding items in this package is investments in US missile defences, and specifically the Golden Dome. I'm going to be treating that as out of scope today because that particular mega project very much deserves its own episode. With that caveat in place, it's time to turn our eye to the question of what $150 billion buys you in 2025. But first, a word from a sponsor. Today, I'm welcoming back Odoo, an all-in-one family of business software with 45 plus business applications covering a range of purposes. For example, if you want to set up a website quickly, easily and efficiently, their website builder has you covered, and you've previously seen me working on a Perun-style website using Odoo. But what if you wanted your website to be a bit more web store and integrate some e-commerce functions? With Odoo, that's easy enough. First, we use Odoo to generate an online store, complete with an easy-to-customize theme, pages and layout. Then, we add our products, entering key information like the name, the price, and of course the display image. It's then simple enough to customize the rest of the page using drag and drop content blocks and images, just as with the rest of the e-commerce store. Next, with some products in place, you could set up the necessary functions to help you get them sold. For example, entering your tax and banking details, establishing an invoice design, setting up your delivery options, and your payment providers. And just like that, you might be a long way towards your first sales. Odoo allows you to get started launching your e-commerce store for free with its lifetime free first app offer. That includes hosting and support, as well as a personalized domain name for the first year. So if you're interested in checking out today's sponsor Odoo and everything they offer, there'll be a link below in the description that you can click. And so with my thanks to them for their support of the channel, let's get back to it. Okay, so because I don't believe in bearing the lead, especially when a lot of data analysis is involved, I want to start by going straight to some of the big picture reasons about why this matters, with the first being the sheer scale of the investment, and the second being what that investment is in. The scale matters because even by the standards of a US defense budget and a slightly devalued dollar, $150 billion is a shitload of money. And it comes after a period in which the traditional spending advantage of the United States over its potential adversaries and its allies has been somewhat eroded. As the primary security exporter across the US alliance system and the world's foremost military power, if you go back and look at the situation a decade ago, the US was spending well over twice as much of its GDP on defence as the rest of its NATO allies, pushing north of 3.6% in 2014 according to NATO data, as opposed to less than 1.5% for the rest of the alliance. But despite continued Chinese military modernisation and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, US spending in 2023 and 2024 was actually lower in percentage terms than it was in 2021, while the rest of NATO hit that 2% target in 2024 and is expected to sail well past it in 2025. In 2013, the rest of the Allies made up less than 30% of NATO military spending. By 2024, it was closer to 40%, and with some of the plans we've heard announced, if nothing had changed, you would have expected to see that number move closer and closer to parity in the coming years. The basic gist here is that while the United States has remained far and away the largest defence spender globally, for the last couple of years, it's been the rest of the field aggressively ramping up. Even if you only count the official Russian defence budget, 2025 marked another 25% increase over 2024 levels, and a clear post-Soviet defence spending high. For the last 3 years now, China has maintained an official defence spending increase rate of about 7.2% per annum, well outpacing GDP growth and keeping that country in second place ahead of Russia. To answer that competition and various threats, the United States has been aggressively pushing its allies to ramp up their defence spending. Marco Rubio and others have gone so far as to push the 5% of GDP figure as a target for the NATO alliance, ostensibly including the United States. And while only one NATO nation, Estonia, is likely to actually hit that 5% figure, at least in the near term, the Europeans at this stage look to be directing what are, even by American standards, very real quantities of money at the question of defence spending. Now, seeing all of these global increases, it appears the United States might be about to have a hold my beer moment, not just with this congressional proposal, but with senior officials openly discussing the possibility of a $1 trillion defence budget in the near future. And even in an environment where other countries might enjoy purchasing power parity advantages, $1 trillion, properly spent, is the kind of sum that can buy a package of capabilities that other countries are going to really struggle to match. But I think the real reason this package matters isn't so much because of how large it is, although that's obviously a factor, it's what's in it. Let me explain what I mean. According to NATO data and definitions, this is a fairly standard US defence budget. I chose 2022. And as you can see, NATO divides that into 4 key categories: equipment, your stuff; personnel, your people; your infrastructure and bases; and then helpfully a massive other category, which includes everything from research and development to operations and maintenance. And as you can see, that standard budget spends a lot of money on just running the military as it stands. This $150 billion, meanwhile, is very much a stuff budget. The people slice is very narrow, very roughly 5%. So you have a package of funding that is overwhelmingly directed to 3 things: buying stuff, building up the capacity to make stuff, or designing new stuff. Going further than that, I'd go so far as to argue this is essentially an Asia-Pacific budget. It's not about counterinsurgency and anti-terrorism in Africa. It's not about balancing the Russians in Europe. It's about the industrial base, conventional and nuclear deterrence with an eye on China, as well as a significant chunk of funding focused on the missile defence of the continental United States. In fact, the package sometimes feels so Pacific-focused, there would occasionally be some creative geography involved in order to get more non-Asia-Pacific items into an Asia-Pacific-centric package. For example, there are plenty of ways you could answer a question like, where is Africa? But if you answered the Indo-Pacific, congratulations, you're well qualified to write US defence supplementals apparently, going by the inclusion of $30 million for ISR assets for United States Africa Command in a section specifically titled Enhancement of Department of Defense Resources to Improve Capabilities of United States Indo-Pacific Command. The Arctic is also apparently in the Indo-Pacific, by the way, based on where it was included in this funding package. Through the lens of wider US strategic objectives, or even just with a view to global competition with Beijing, those kind of investments arguably make a lot of sense. It's just telling, I think, that in this package they don't get to stand alone, and instead find themselves wedged under the Indo-PACOM heading. Another interesting thing that stands out to me is the timelines for a lot of these investments, where the emphasis very much makes this feel like not so much a fight tomorrow or fight in the 2040s budget, but rather fight midterm. There are too many industrial and research and development focused investment items for me to feel like this is Congress panicking over the ability of the US to fight in 2026 or 2027. There's plenty of investments in programs that are probably only likely to yield a return in the latter part of the 2020s or the early 2030s. But at the same time, I also saw very little investment in very, very long-term items. There's nothing for programs like SSNX, which is likely to only turn up in the 2040s, for example. And so while there's a spread of investments in this budget, some of which will have a near immediate impact, a lot of the budgetary spear point feels focused on maximising outcomes in the late 2020s through early 2030s. A final note is there seems to be greater congressional comfort here with providing broader, sometimes longer-term funding. The reason I say this is, one, because a lot of the funding in this package doesn't expire until 2029, meaning that if it's approved, the Pentagon can choose to spread it over multiple years to carry a program to completion. And secondly, because a lot of the authorizations are for DPI, development, procurement or production, and integration. The low-cost cruise missile programs, for example, aren't being given $1.5 billion just to design the missiles. They're being given that to develop them, start buying them, and getting them integrated into the force, which is particularly useful for the military and industry if they're trying to plan ahead and make longer-term investments, because they're not entirely reliant on having to repitch for funding every 12 months. I will say, of course, there's still a chance for some or all of this to change, and eventually they have to be voted by the Congress as a whole. But given this is a reconciliation process rather than a regular US budgetary process, the chance of most of it making through is probably higher than in a conventional budget. And even if elements don't make it all the way to the end, I still think this is a useful exercise because it tells us a lot about perceived American military priorities. The budget is ultimately the Yoda test of defence economics. Fund or fund not, there is no try. And $150 billion gives us a lot of clues as to where the United States is really, really going to try. In most of the public summaries I've seen released so far, the spending is divided up into a couple of large headings. $9 billion for service member quality of life, $34 billion for shipbuilding and the maritime industrial base, $25 billion for missile defence and the Golden Dome, and then $21 billion for munitions, $14 billion to expedite innovation to the warfighter, $13 billion for nuclear deterrence, $12 billion for readiness, $11 billion for Pacific deterrence specifically, that, as we noted, isn't just about the Pacific, $7 billion for air superiority, $5 billion for border security, and $400 million for fiscal responsibility and the pursuit of a clean audit of the Pentagon. As you might have guessed though, the actual package is much more granular than that. There aren't 11 line items, there are about 250. And so I went through and categorised, subcategorised, and commented each of them, so that hopefully as we go through some of these big areas, I can answer a couple of key questions for you. Namely, what's there, what isn't, and what might that tell us? And to illustrate that point, I think a good place to start is with the largest single section in the package, a combined $34 billion for shipbuilding and the US maritime industrial base. Because if you're looking for clues that this really is a Pacific-centric budget, this is where it starts. Eventually, we'll do a detailed study of US military shipbuilding, but suffice to say over the last couple of decades, the sector hasn't so much had a series of moments as a massive prolonged post-Cold War and later post-COVID hangover. Costs have increased, there are output, workforce and supply chain challenges that make it difficult for the sector to keep the Navy at the strength the Navy would like to be at. And of course, there have been a series of interesting and well-discussed design and procurement decisions around a series of US ship classes, from the LCS to the Zumwalt destroyers to now the Constellation-class frigates. By contrast, the military shipbuilding capacity of other countries, specifically the People's Republic of China, and then to a lesser extent the Republic of Korea and Japan, absolutely slaps. For example, the United States currently produces roughly 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers per year. South Korea's Hyundai Heavy Industries, meanwhile, has apparently suggested they could scale up to 5 destroyers per annum if the demand was there, turning out increasingly modern designs, in quantity, for cheap. There are still areas where US military shipyards remain unmatched. Those nuclear-powered aircraft carriers don't exactly just spawn into existence the moment someone passes a budget for them. But as a whole, the sector in the US has been facing some pretty significant cost and capacity constraints. The US Navy, for example, has a target of 66 nuclear-powered fast attack submarines. But by a CRS estimate, the force is actually expected to shrink to 46 by 2030, and only then slowly start building up to the point where it does hit 66 submarines in 2049. In the Pacific theatre, it's really some of these larger, more capable platforms, the nuclear-powered submarines, the destroyers, the carriers, the amphibious support ships, and the auxiliary vessels that support them, that are really expected to be critical assets. And so what this package essentially seems to do is come at the problem from 2 directions. Topping up funding to procure additional vessels on one hand, and then investing a lot in the industrial base to actually make sure they can be built. There's an extra Virginia-class submarine, presumably with the extra payload module that allows the submarine to carry a lot more missiles, to be procured in fiscal year 2027. Originally, the Navy's goal was only to purchase 1 Virginia that year, so Congress has topped them up to 2, with an additional $4.6 billion US. There are 2 additional Arleigh Burke-class destroyers at about $2.7 billion per unit, and some serious amphibious warfare potential. There's an additional America-class LHA for $3.7 billion, an F-35 capable platform large enough that in some other navies it might be called an aircraft carrier, and $2.1 billion for the smaller San Antonio class. That second point's actually a major turnaround, considering the Navy proposed back in its 2023 budget to end production of the San Antonio class, and then to start shedding hulls from its amphibious fleet. The program was essentially placed into a strategic pause for a period, before being resurrected with a multi-ship, multi-year contract back in 2024, with even more funding now being packaged here. On an obviously completely unrelated note, there is a gross generalisation that when military services are forced to make hard cuts to their budget, they tend to focus on protecting the missions that are most important to them and cutting the missions that are important to someone else. Given a choice between cutting ground attack and air superiority, for example, you'd struggle to find an air force that would rather retain its A-10s over its fighters. The US Navy doesn't just have the job of controlling sea lanes, destroying enemy fleets, or bombing people. It also has the job of taxiing the Marine Corps around the world to wherever Washington wants to ship its little mobile fear generators. And while US Navy budget proposals don't always seem to prioritise the armed maritime Uber role, tellingly, Congress seems to think it's very, very important. adding just in this package an LHA, an LPD, and nearly $2 billion for medium landing ships capable of transporting units of Marines and their heavy equipment. Given some of the other investments we're seeing in marine missile capabilities, so you could potentially land a small force of Marines on an island and turn it into a giant anti-ship battery, it may be that Congress sees amphibious ships as a vital part of making that power projection technique possible. There's also some boring but practical purchases. We won't go through all of them, but a decent example here might be roughly $2.7 billion for reportedly 3 additional oilers for the US Navy. Again, not glamorous, but unless you're packing nuclear reactors, your ship's not going anywhere without fuel. Then there's a series of Navy-focused investments that I think should be viewed together. Previously, we've heard the US Navy, and Indo-PACOM specifically, talk about their subtly named hellscape concept. At the core of the concept is the capacity to take a certain area of ocean and absolutely flood it with so many drones and other systems that an adversary is going to have a very, very tough time operating there, at least for the short term. Indo-PACOM's commander, Admiral Samuel Paparo, dropped the subtlety in terms of what area of ocean they might be talking about, reportedly saying to the Washington Post, quote, "I want to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities so I can make their lives utterly miserable for a month, which buys me time for the rest of everything," end quote. And while he put the focus there on classified capabilities, there's a fair amount of unclassified items in this package that might fit that brief. For example, there are a lot of naval drones here, more than $1.8 billion for medium unmanned surface vessels, then $1.3 billion for unmanned underwater vessels, and then separately funding for wave-powered UUVs as a distinct item. Those would presumably be exactly what it says on the tin. UUVs that could potentially extend their range and endurance by harnessing waves, a power source that does tend to be fairly common at sea. Adding to the higher tech elements of the potential hellscape, though, are a lot of established capabilities and much simpler systems. The Navy submarines get a lot of bang. $400 million for more Mark 48 torpedoes, $200 million for commercial heavyweight torpedoes, which I interpret to probably be the Raptor program or something similar, $70 billion for torpedo maintenance, $200 million for lightweight torpedoes, and then, interestingly, more than $500 million for naval mines, specifically $150 million for long-range air-delivered maritime mines and $500 million for the conventional product. While $650 million US dollars thereabouts might not stand out in a package of $150 billion, in the context of recent US Navy budgets, it absolutely should. The US historically made very effective use of naval mines. During World War II, US aircraft laid about 12,000 of the things in Japanese shipping routes and harbour approaches, which is claimed to have delivered results out of all proportion to the cost of the mines and the other resources used. In the post-Cold War era, and with the collapse of the Soviet Navy though, the US hasn't really seen a need for significant investments in mining. There's an interesting article I'll link in the description by a current serving US Navy commander. He observes that in fiscal year 2020, out of a $4.1 billion munition buy for the US Navy, only $5 million, just over 0.1%, was spent on mines. For one of the 2 active mining systems, the Quick Strike, which is essentially an extended range JDAM converted into a naval mine, spending only reached a grand total of $85 million through fiscal year 2020. In other words, the Navy very much took its foot off the pedal when it comes to mine development and procurement. A potential positive side effect of that, though, from the US Navy perspective, is that because it hasn't been investing in mines, a lot of its potential competitors haven't been investing in mine countermeasures. As the commander put it, quote, "China has not invested heavily in mine countermeasures, partly because the United States does not maintain a significant mine inventory. Although the People's Liberation Army Navy maintains mine countermeasure platforms, its equipment is largely outdated, except for a small number of newer vessels and unproven experimental unmanned underwater vehicles," end quote. So what this package does is essentially ramp up mine funding by about 100 times over fiscal 2020 levels and closer to 10 times over the already elevated 2024 levels. There's $150 million for long-range air-delivered maritime mines, which I take to mean the Quick Strike, a testament to the fact that when there is a munitions requirement, the US will always look for a way to use JDAM first. The larger $500 million maritime mine item doesn't specify. The US has operated a whole range of mining concepts, both now and historically. One small clue in the wording, though, is that it's a DPI item, meaning we're potentially either looking at an improved version of something that already exists or something entirely new. A potential candidate then might be the Hammerhead project, which actually got some funding in the base 2024 budget. Hammerhead is reportedly an encapsulated torpedo mine, apparently designed with UUVs in mind. Basically, you moor a container, including a Mark 54 lightweight torpedo, which comes with a sensor module, so when it does detect a potential target coming by, instead of just detonating, which obviously requires the target to get quite close to the mine, it can instead yeet that torpedo at it. Again, the package doesn't specify that this is an encapsulated mine intended to be used by underwater drones, but I think that would be a decent guess given what we've seen from recent US Navy budget requests. My overall point then is that a lot of these investments seem to potentially click together in a way that might align with a desired US capability to make particular parts of the Pacific very, very dangerous, at least for short periods. There are a series of other smaller supporting US Navy items, $600 million for sea lift capacity, $500 million for rescue and salvage ships, that kind of thing. But the real crux, after you look at the ship orders, but before you get to some of the munition orders that we'll reach a little bit later on, are the investments in America's shipbuilding capacity. There's a laundry list of items here, adding up to, depending on how you classify them, north of $5 billion US dollars. There are some big ones that were probably expected, $750 million for supplier development, $500 million for additional dry dock capacity, and then funding for everything from next-generation shipbuilding techniques to the application of autonomy and AI in shipbuilding. A number of items essentially feel like bottleneck busters. $450 million for wire production and machining capacity in shipbuilding, $450 million to develop the maritime industrial workforce, $295 million for an extra LCU shipyard, $250 million for training in the defence manufacturing program, and then $250 million for turbine generator production, $110 million for rolled steel fabrication, $85 million for steel plate for shipbuilding, $50 million for cold spray repair technologies, and $50 million for machining capacity for naval propellers. This is really the only section where I'll go through, line by line like that, because I'm trying to make a point. The US military shipbuilding sector doesn't have one problem, one bottleneck. It has lots of problems and bottlenecks. And what we see in this package is lots of individual line items targeted against those individual issues. There are two closing notes I want to add here about that industry side funding. The first is while there is never any context in which $5 billion is not a lot of money, if there were a candidate for that position, fixing the accumulated problems in US military shipbuilding would probably be up there. The flip side is that $5 billion is far from the only money going into the sector. The Navy's recent and forward shipbuilding plans call for a lot of funding. And there have been significant other capital inflows, not just from other parts of the US budget, but also from other countries. Under the AUKUS agreement, for example, Australia has already handed over $500 million US to ramp up production of US Navy submarines, and in the coming months and years is meant to hand over significantly more. The assumption being that if the US Navy can produce more submarines, it'll be in a much better position to sell off second-hand versions to the Royal Australian Navy. There is, of course, technically a possibility that the US could take the money, not produce enough submarines anyway, and then leave Canberra a couple of billion out of pocket with no submarines to show for it. But what are the odds of something like that actually happening? The point is this package doesn't aim to solve all the woes the US Navy has in maintaining and building up its fleet size, but what it does do is fund a couple of very significant platforms, some interesting capabilities that would probably be particularly relevant in the Pacific, and makes an additional payment towards making sure that US industry can actually provide the ships and submarines that the Navy says it's going to need in the decades to come. Of course, as we discussed even just last week, conventional military actions, especially against a high-tier opponent, don't just require top-tier platforms, they need munitions. And those make up a significant chunk of this overall $150 billion. While the package doesn't explicitly divide it up this way, I'd argue the section includes at least three core goals: building up existing stocks of high-end standoff and anti-aircraft munitions, expanding production capacity for those munitions, and also signalling something of a change in emphasis for the United States Marine Corps, and especially for the US Army. So far as the replenishment and procurement of existing Navy and Air Force systems, it's not quite a case of Keanu Reeves declaring that he wants missiles, lots of missiles, but it is a pretty significant order list. $93 million to replace Navy long-range air and missile defense interceptors, $688 million for multi-service cruise missiles and $250 million for the production capacity for them, $630 million for the development, procurement and integration of long-range United States Navy air defense and anti-ship missiles, $490 million for long-range air-to-surface missiles for the Navy and the United States Air Force, $94 million for the development, procurement, integration of alternative long-range air-to-surface missiles, again for the US Air Force and US Navy, and then large chunks of funding for US Navy and Air Force long-range anti-ship missiles, which I think is reasonably likely to be referring to the literal long-range anti-ship missile, the anti-shipping version of the AGM-158 JASSM. There you've got an extra $400 million for the development, production and integration of the missiles, and $380 million for additional production capacity. That last one I think is especially notable because Lockheed Martin has already said they're pushing the production line for the JASSM and LRASM to 1,100 per annum. And it was only in March that we saw an additional $122.6 million dedicated to ramping up production of the missiles in Orlando by 2028, meaning it might well be that the US currently regards a production rate of 1,100 stealthy long-range cruise and anti-ship missiles per annum as actually inadequate and needing some further scale-up. I'd argue, though, that what's even more interesting than the Air Force and Navy spending is what we see for the Army and the Marine Corps. As best we can tell, the US Army is very much about to be a force in flux. There have been major changes announced to its future structure and equipment, and we'll explore more of those in another episode. But one element of that is that a lot of platforms that are described as outdated or obsolete are getting thwacked pretty hard with the budgetary axe. The totally not a light tank, the M10 Booker, which turned out not to be that light anyway, is apparently gone. And the Razor Gang are also apparently looking to take swipes at things like the AH-64 Apache and the Grey Eagle drone. But against the backdrop of that Army Transformation Initiative, this package actually appears to hand Army a couple of funding items, with a lot of it falling into one of two categories: missiles or missile, air and drone defence. The Army gets $30 million for the repair of existing missiles, $100 million to develop an anti-ship seeker for its short-range ballistic missiles, nearly $700 million for the development, production or production capacity for medium-range ballistic missiles, $400 million for hypersonic strike, which I take to be the Dark Eagle system firing that hypersonic glide vehicle, and $85 million for the development of an Army long-range ballistic missile. For a force who, not that long ago, only had one relatively short-range tactical ballistic missile option, ATACMS, what you're looking at here is a very significant shift. There's the short-range ballistic missile option, presumably the PrSM, a focus on an anti-shipping capability for it, and then funding for some much longer-range systems. Medium-range ballistic missiles, which traditionally mean systems with a range between 1,000 and 3,500 kilometres, long-range ballistic missiles, and the long-range hypersonic weapon, which will presumably allow the US Army to get into the business of addressing their regards to sets of coordinates thousands of kilometres away. Part of what we're arguably seeing here is the results of the end of the INF Treaty. That was originally an agreement between the US and Soviet Union, which effectively banned ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges of between 500 and 5,500 kilometres, roughly 310 to 3,400 miles. That caused the US Army to get rid of both its ground-launched Tomahawks and its Pershing missiles. That agreement, however, effectively died in 2019, meaning US ground forces are now once again allowed to possess much longer-ranged fires, which they may potentially see as a valuable capability given the sheer distances involved in the Asia-Pacific. It's not entirely clear from the way the package is worded how many distinct missile systems we're talking about here, as opposed to range increments on existing designs like PrSM. What is clear is there's a lot more emphasis, at least in this package, on the Marine Corps and the Army operating as missile-slinging forces, with the Marines being the lighter, more mobile force, equipped with things like unmanned launchers for naval strike missiles capable of hitting ships hundreds of kilometres away, while the Army is tending towards larger, heavier, less mobile systems, but with significantly longer ranges. One that's capable of providing higher-level commanders access to long-range precision fires, alongside more traditional sources like the Air Force and the Navy. Then you have another cluster of funding items, putting focus on a second primary Army role, which again to me screams Pacific Theatre, which is to function not just as missile slingers, but as missile and air defenders, perhaps also helping provide protection for things like American air bases or critical military installations. There's money here for short-range air defences, $50 million to accelerate the purchase of new manpads, and even $65 million to work on cross-compatibility between the Army's PAC-3 interceptor for the Patriot system and Navy vertical launch systems, meaning the Navy might have access not just to another potentially useful capability, but also another missile stockpile and production chain if it needs to keep up with demand on its warships. Finally, in the not getting killed by things that fly category, there's also $250 million for land-based counter-drone systems. But in that respect, across the breadth of this package, potential users like the Army and the Marine Corps are far from unique. There is $250 million there for the development, procurement, integration of land-based CUAS, but there's also $200 million for ship-based CUAS, $350 million for non-kinetic CUAS, and $500 million for just CUAS. All in all, around $1.2 billion specifically for anti-drone systems, let alone other funded items like gun-based short-range air defences that are significantly but not entirely about countering drone threats. In that respect, I think we can say this package is serious about trying to better protect US forces against drone threats, but from an Army transformation perspective, I think the more interesting elements are those longer-range missile systems, the anti-shipping seekers, the missile defence radars, and higher-end air defence options. If the focus here is on the Asia-Pacific, and I think it pretty clearly is, The goal here doesn't appear to be on bulking out traditional army ground combat capabilities for a place like Korea, for example. It's on building up the ability of the army to serve as an air and missile defence and long-range fires provider to the rest of the joint force. While the Marine Corps presumably sneaks onto a couple of islands, digs in, and then presumably goes on to try and make life deeply unpleasant for any enemy ships within hundreds of kilometres of their new beachfront property. A final note to make here before we move on from munitions is that while there's significant funding here to develop and procure stuff, there's also a lot of money to go into the industrial base that produces it. I think the war in Ukraine has very clearly demonstrated just how easy it is for munitions demand to outstrip munitions supply during a major conflict, and so what you can find in this package is billions of dollars targeted at lifting productive capacity. I won't go through every item, but there are a couple that stand out, including $3.5 billion in industrial base fund grants, hundreds of millions of dollars for rocket motor production, $1 billion for next-generation automated munitions plants, and another $1 billion to build up the US production base for one-way attack UAS. Think things that might be in broadly the same category as Ukraine's one-way attack drones or Russia's Shaheds. Compared to those Ukrainian or Russian efforts, $1 billion of capital investment is a very significant chunk of change, especially since, as far as I'm aware, the United States actually hasn't started ordering one-way attack drones in anything like Russian or Ukrainian quantities. That said, if you're going to invest that much money in the ability to manufacture something, it's probably a bit of a clue that you do intend to produce it. And so we might expect to see more one-way attack drones appearing in future US defence budgets and supplementals. Rather than going line by line through the industry side of the munitions piece, I thought instead I'd draw out a couple of key observations. One, even though the combined bundle here is pushing into the low 11-digit range, the change in actual investment momentum might be somewhat smaller. That's because since 2022, a lot of the investment that's been made in ramping up US munitions production has been done through Ukraine aid packages, both directly with funding to ramp up production and also with replacement funding intended to purchase new equipment, prompting industry to scale up production. To illustrate, in January, the White House released figures on the claimed production rate increases for selected systems that had attracted about $5.5 billion in investment since 2022. That ranged from a 178% increase in 155mm artillery shells to a 116% increase in PAC-3 missiles for the Patriot system, a 40% boost in production of GMLRS rockets for HIMARS, and a 60% increase in the production of HIMARS themselves, and smaller increases in the 14 to 18% range for things like Javelin and the AIM-9X Sidewinder. With new US aid packages for Ukraine seemingly unlikely to be forthcoming, one potential source of funding for these kind of ramp-ups is no longer there, meaning it comes back more to the regular budget or packages like this one to deliver that funding instead. Note too is that the focus of some of these industrial investments seems to be changing. There are some commonalities, like a continuing major investment in solid rocket motor production, which has long been identified as a bottleneck, but there's comparatively less focus on some of those weapons most useful in the Ukrainian battlefield, like Javelin, artillery shells, or the regular GMLRS rockets for HIMARS, and instead more on cruise missiles, one-way attack UAS, affordable alternatives to cruise missiles, and medium-range air-to-air munitions. It's an imperfect exercise to say so, but it certainly feels like the budget is skewing more towards the longer range and higher end, and also more towards development and capacity for systems that may not even be fielded yet, as opposed to more established ones, which again I think points to a little bit more focus on the medium term, rather than the scramble we saw to meet Ukraine-related emergency requirements in 2022 or 2023. There's also $2.5 billion to stockpile additional critical minerals, so all of this new industry has something to make all these munitions out of in the event of a crisis, and also a notable push towards cheaper munitions, platforms, and the technologies around them. There's $1 billion for the development, procurement, and integration of affordable cruise missiles, which we discussed in a recent episode, and an extra $500 million for the DPI of exportable affordable cruise missiles. And again, we covered some of what that might mean last week. A big bet, though, seems to be that by integrating more civilian technology into military systems, costs can potentially be brought down. There's $2 billion for the Defence Innovation Unit to scale the use of commercial technology for military use, $1.1 billion for the small UAS production base, and a lot of smaller items targeted at useful supporting technologies. AI for one-way attack drones, for example, got more than $100 million in funding, while also potentially reflecting some experience for Ukraine. There was $40 million for alternative positioning and navigation technology that could operate in contested EM environments. The broad takeaway, based on some of these industrial capacity investments, is that we should expect to see US forces not just with access to a greater supply of their higher-end munitions, but also potentially a few more affordable ones as well, or at least affordable by US military standards, not necessarily Russian or Ukrainian ones. Okay, so moving on to another domain entirely, let's talk air superiority, a traditional requirement for just about every US military campaign of the last 80 years, and an area where this package claims to allocate about $7 billion, although I'd argue some of the other investments in other sections feed into this area as well. But the core idea is the air superiority funding is focused on getting the aircraft the Air Force and the Navy needs, while a lot of the other elements they might need to actually carry out the air superiority mission are nested in other sections. Instead, what this segment pretty heavily focuses on is mass now and quality in the future. By far the biggest line item at $3.15 billion is increasing production of the F-15EX. It's not clear how that funding balances between additional production capacity for the jet and actually ordering additional jets, but it's worth noting that last year the US Air Force said they wanted to work towards a fleet of about 98 of these aircraft, while previously there had been plans to go to 144. Were all of that additional funding to be focused on buying additional jets rather than ramping up production capacity specifically, $3.15 billion would probably buy you an additional double-digit number of the things, starting with a 3. But depending on what else needs to come out of that $3+ billion budget, the number of actual additional jets could hypothetically range down as far as 0. The F-15EX is an interesting one in the Pacific context because it doesn't have the stealth features of something like the F-22 or the F-35, but what it can do is truck a lot of missiles and ordnance a long way relatively quickly. And so if you're looking for something that could act in more permissive environments or as the shooter to a stealthier and more survivable sensor, the Air Force might see a platform like this as a good candidate for the job. Obviously, the other main way to increase mass in the short term, besides just increasing aircraft production, is to throw away fewer of the aircraft you already have, and here too, the package has some serious funding. There's $361 million to stop retirements of older model F-22 Raptors, and $127 million to hold off retirements of F-15E Strike Eagles. Both of these line items represent another chapter in a long and continuing story. The short version is that about 20% of the US F-22 fleet, roughly 30 aircraft, are older models of the aircraft that the US Air Force has constantly said would be uneconomical to upgrade. Consequently, for a number of years, the Air Force has continued to try and retire the things in order to free up space in the budget for other newer investments. Congress, for its part, has then continuously blocked those retirements. What they appear to have done here then is actually give the Air Force money to keep the things flying. With the Strike Eagles, it's a broadly similar story. About 120 of the 280 in current service have older engines. The Air Force subsequently targeted those airframes for retirement by no later than fiscal year 2028, but for the moment, Congress has blocked retirement of any of those aircraft until at least fiscal year 2027. It's not clear to me then that this kind of funding will actually stop the Air Force from retiring any of these aircraft. They were already prevented from doing so. The difference may simply be that they have funding to back up that instruction, and so don't have to go through the process of hunting around trying to find that money somewhere else in the budget, whether it's by cancelling an exercise, reducing flight hours, or cutting back on essential Air Force quality of life features. Maybe the professional barista is fired, or lobster and caviar get downgraded to sometimes foods. But if that was the price of achieving air superiority in a peer conflict, the question you really have to ask is, would it even be worth it at that point? The EA-37 and C-130 get production funding. Then we have 3 tiers of future-focused qualitative uplift. $50 million to accelerate F-16 electronic warfare capability, $100 million to produce advanced aerial sensors. And then it's the real next-generation stuff. Both American 6th-generation fighter programs get additional funding to hurry them up. $400 million for the Air Force's F-47 and $500 million for the Navy's F/A-XX. As for the CCAs, the large drones intended to fly alongside these and other American aircraft, that effort gets topped up to the tune of $678 million. Finally, to round it all out, there's more than $500 million for we don't know. $300 million for classified US Air Force programs in this air superiority category, and $230 million for the US Navy in the same. In the end, your guess is as good as mine, so we should probably move into the big picture takeaway here. By itself, the air superiority section of this package is fairly one-dimensional. It's mostly aircraft production, aircraft upgrades, and preventing aircraft retirements, with a healthy dose of accelerating those next-generation fighter programs thrown in. But it's when you read it in combination with a number of the other provisions that I think it takes on additional meaning. For example, in the munitions section, you'll find funding for a bunch of missiles that you might use against a peer or near-peer opposing air force, and support for the industry that produces them. There's $250 million to purchase additional AMRAAMs, $50 million to mitigate the effect of diminishing manufacturing sources for AMRAAM, and $225 million to ramp up production of the system even further. To put that in perspective, the production capacity for the AMRAAM is already reportedly churning on at about 1,200 per year. But between additional US Air Force orders and the sea of recent foreign orders, the US is probably calculating that it needs more coming off the line. Reportedly through 2024 and early 2025, foreign countries ordered a casual 4,600 AMRAAMs. So the calculation may actually be that it's a net economic win for the United States to invest in additional production, in the hopes that that unlocks additional profitable sales to allies, as well as a better supply for the US Air Force. Added to the AMRAAM spend, there was $325 million for more production capacity for anti-radiation missiles and $50 million for second sources for AIM-9 components. Then in another section focused on increasing the readiness of the United States Indo-Pacific Command, remembering none of the other combatant commands get their own section, you'll find $450 million for airfields, $200 million for the Guam Defense System, and $1.1 billion for general Indo-PACOM infrastructure. So we have a lot of funding for additional fighters, including dedicated air superiority platforms like the F-22 Raptor that are really expensive overkill against any opponent that doesn't have significant capabilities, money for a bunch of air-to-air missiles for those aircraft to use, and a bunch of money for bases to position them in the Pacific. It's not clear how much funding, if any, will be drawn from these lines for defensive preparations at US air bases in the Asia-Pacific, like hardened aircraft shelters. But given what Ukraine has shown us about the potential threat of things like cluster munitions or small drones against aircraft that aren't adequately protected, it'll be interesting to see the answer once it becomes publicly apparent. And then to top it all off, unlike the other combatant commands, Indo-PACOM gets a large chunk of funding specifically for Air Force exercises. The operations, exercises, and training top-up, so to speak, for Indo-PACOM is north of $2.5 billion in total. $1 billion of that is for offensive cyber warfare operations, which I imagine buys you just a couple spam phishing emails. But there's about $500 million for the Pacific Air Force's large biannual exercises. These things are typically huge. Think hundreds of aircraft, an exercise larger than some air forces. And with that funding top-up, I imagine they just got a little bit larger or more involved than they otherwise might have been. So you have more and better aircraft with more and better missiles operating from more and better bases, specifically in the Pacific, and then exercises to give US and allied forces an opportunity to practice bringing it all together. It's that kind of combination of investments, coupled with the fact that we don't see similar top-ups for EUCOM, that caused me to argue that this isn't really just an air superiority package, it's a Pacific air superiority package. Probably not enough by itself to change the balance, but possibly enough to move the needle. That really leads quite well into the next segment then, which is a nominal $13 billion investment in America's nuclear forces. I do want to say up front though that practically speaking, that number probably gives the wrong impression. In part because the single biggest item under the heading, more than a third of the total, $4.5 billion US, is being poured straight into the B-21 Raider program, America's new strategic stealth bomber. And I say it might give the wrong impression because yes, the B-21 Raider, like the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber before it, does have a role delivering nuclear weapons. But unless we find ourselves living in a timeline that causes humanity to think back fondly to the days of the bubonic plague, the B-21 will probably spend most of its actual sorties dropping conventional ordnance. From a US perspective, the nuclear mission is an important one and you need the equipment for it, but it thankfully doesn't come up too often. At this point, stealth bombers deploying conventional munitions, though, is an every-year event. And so I think it's just as likely, if not more likely, that this investment in a nuclear asset ends up actually contributing more in the conventional role. The large funding pot also raises a question. What is it for? Because the latest reporting, including from US congressmen, is that the B-21 Raider is coming in ahead of schedule and on budget. With the on-budget thing probably being partly linked to the fact that there are a lot of fixed-price contracts involved, meaning that when costs did blow out, thanks to inflation and supply chain disruptions, it was the prime contractor, Northrop Grumman, that ended up eating a lot of that cost. And over the years, Northrop Grumman has written off some pretty significant losses against the B-21 program. But the question then remains, if from the American government's perspective, the B-21 program is going just fine, why add $4.5 billion earmarked to accelerate it? It could be the intention is still to order the same number of aircraft, just to pay extra to try and get them delivered sooner. But likewise, it might also be a precursor to trying to get the total order increased. All we know for certain is that we've been told the target entry date for the B-21 into service was sometime in the mid-2020s. So if the intention is to accelerate that timeline, we could potentially expect to see these things in service sometime in the next 18 months. From there, we move into more specialised nuclear-only assets, as opposed to a dual-use capability like the B-21. At a high level, there's north of $1 billion for existing nuclear delivery systems, so improvements to the Minuteman III, production for the D5 rocket motor for Trident, and $100 million for capability enhancements for re-entry vehicles, which, given the established capability of existing re-entry vehicles going back to the 1970s and 80s, might point to some interesting perceived threats or challenges. perhaps an opposing missile defense system, or a requirement for even more accuracy. The next-generation Sentinel ICBM that is meant to replace the Minuteman, basically the grey goo of the US Air Force budget, in the sense that it's a high-priority no-fail program that thus tends to consume other parts of the budget in order to enlarge itself, is allocated an additional $1.5 billion in this package, 1% of the total, for risk reduction. Out of the dedicated nuclear delivery systems in this overall package, however, so putting aside B-21, it's not actually Sentinel that gets the most funding. It's the Navy's Sea-Launched Cruise Missile Nuclear, the SLCMN. And this thing's interesting, because it's a relatively simple concept with a very complex history. The US Navy first got a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile back in the mid-1980s when it put a nuclear warhead on Tomahawk. In 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, President Bush announced the United States would be withdrawing all of its sea-based tactical nuclear weapons from its surface ships, from its submarines, and its naval aircraft. By mid-1992, those nuclear Tomahawks had been stored, until the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review identified the missiles as a system that served a redundant purpose, leading them to be retired by 2013. And from there, the will they or won't they story of US Navy nuclear cruise missile development in the 21st century was really only getting started. In 2018, the Trump administration decided that it was a bad idea to have retired the nuclear Tomahawks, and thus the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, remembering the 2010 one had retired the missiles in the first place, decided that what the United States Navy really needed was 2 additional types of nuclear weapon, a low-yield warhead for the SLBMs and a nuclear-tipped cruise missile. The idea was the low-yield warhead for the SLBM would be available sooner, but for various reasons, including mitigating the risk that someone might see a Trident missile being launched and wrongly conclude that it was a strategic attack rather than a tactical one, the SLCMN was envisioned as a longer-term option. Trident got its lower-yield warhead in 2020, but the nuke-tipped cruise missile wasn't ready in time for the change in administration. In 2022, the White House argued for eliminating the program. The Navy's budget request in Fiscal 23 eliminated any funding for it. But despite the White House opposing it and the Navy not asking for it, Congress continued to fund it anyway, authorising $45 million for the missile and its warhead in 2023, $260 million in Fiscal 24, and $322 million for the missile and warhead in fiscal year 2025. Now, with this additional package, Congress is basically adding a zero, adding $2 billion for development, procurement, and integration of the SLCM itself, and a further $400 million on top of that for accelerated DPI of the warhead. All of which is to say, whether or not the White House has decided it actually wants a low-yield nuclear cruise missile for the Navy's warships or not, Congress has decided that's what they're getting, and they put up the money to do it. Where exactly a nuclear-tipped cruise missile will fit into America's nuclear deterrence posture is very much a debated question, but it's very likely intended to fit somewhere on the non-strategic rungs of the nuclear escalation ladder. Basically something that gives the United States the option to employ nuclear force without resorting to full-scale strategic missiles in order to do it. The question I'd ask in the context of this episode, though, is what theatre, if any, can you imagine a sea-launched or submarine-launched nuclear weapon like this being most useful? I'd argue that in Europe, or facing off against Russia in general, the United States and NATO already has established options. Both France and the United States already have nuclear-tipped air-launched cruise missiles and programs to replace their existing systems on the way. NATO's nuclear sharing system involves nuclear gravity bombs that could be delivered by F-35. And because of the distances and bases involved, warning times in the European theatre, even using those kind of systems, could be relatively short. To me then, that suggests this missile is probably most naturally a fit for the Pacific. Although what impact, if any, it has on the perceived strategic balance and deterrence picture in Asia, only time will tell. But the next time you get a present for your birthday or Christmas that is absolutely not what you asked for, spare a thought to just how difficult it must be to re-gift a nuclear weapon when Congress gets you one that you're not consistently sure that you even need. The final element I want to touch on in the nuclear section has to do with the nuclear industrial complex. And here, for the most part, we're talking about the National Nuclear Safety Administration, or NNSA. This is the organisation dealing with, among other things, America's nuclear weapons, where hundreds of employees earlier this year got notices that they were being let go, only for there to be rapid efforts to rehire many of them, because apparently nuclear weapon production and safety isn't an area that you want to see short-staffed. Having effectively dodged at least most of those budget cuts then, this funding package actually includes significant additional funding for the NNSA and its workforce. There's $1 billion to construct and modernise NNSA facilities, $540 million for deferred maintenance, And by the way, I'm sure everyone is thrilled to hear there's apparently $500 million of deferred maintenance and repair to be done at facilities supporting nuclear weapons. And then on top of that, $100 million to accelerate uranium centrifuge deployment, $1.2 billion for NNSA capabilities and studies, and $22 million for classified nuclear deterrence programs. Because as we all know, the most effective deterrent is one that you keep secret and that your opponent doesn't know about. More seriously, we'll probably find out what that means eventually, but for the moment, we can probably summarise the nuclear section like this. There's an effort to better maintain and hold together the nuclear deterrent systems the United States already has. There's a new tactical class of nuclear weapon, funding for a better airborne delivery system, and extra funding for a nuclear industrial complex that was already struggling with America's nuclear modernisation plans as they were. I have a video on that subject if you're interested in more of the details, and I'll link it in the description. There's still a long list of items I could go through, but as we get towards the end, I want to instead pivot to the things that aren't there, or at least a small selection of the omissions that stood out to me. Firstly, if there was any remaining doubt that the United States was pivoting towards preparing for large-scale combat operations against peer or near-peer opponents, this funding package might be one more piece of evidence to suggest that the old focus on counterinsurgency and stability operations is now taking a back seat. Africa Command, with its massive counter-terrorism remit, gets some additional ISR assets, but not much else. There are some significant SOCOM investments, but mostly in the Asia-Pacific. And a massive lion's share of the funding is going into high-end missile systems and platforms. A lot of the things you might use to face down Moscow or Beijing, not insurgents or irregulars. Similarly, while there's a lot of things in this package that benefit the joint force and thus could be potentially useful to US forces in Europe, there are no specific handouts for European command. There's also not a huge amount here for the more traditional army roles. You wouldn't exactly call the tank force or the cannon artillery winners here, although that doesn't mean the army is entirely missing out when it comes to vehicle funding. There is $250 million for tracked combat transport vehicles, $230 million for wheeled combat vehicles, $100 million to accelerate the fielding of gun-based SHORAD systems, presumably in part for counter-UAS duties, as well as $98 million for light rotary, attack rotary gets nothing, and a line item for $75 million for anti-lock braking systems. But at the risk of oversimplifying, the package here is very much for the benefit of the Missile and Air Defence Army, and not so much for the tanks rolling on the plains of Europe Army. It's also interesting to see that the amount of additional funding for some of the weapon systems we've seen most decisive in the war in Ukraine perhaps isn't as large as you might expect. Here I'm talking about small UAS, think things in the FPV or Mavic category, as well as the increasingly important unmanned ground vehicles, the UGVs. Small UAS get a very large package of funding, including $1 billion specifically earmarked for the industrial base to produce them, but UGVs don't get an equivalent targeted call-out. And while there is that $1 billion for the small UAS industrial base, there isn't a similar scale of cash injection to actually purchase additional drones, suggesting the focus here might be on localising capacity, but with the expectation that existing programs will be sufficient to cover the procurement side. Basically, the small drones are going to continue to arrive in American forces, but they're not going to be drowning their units in supplies of small drones and loitering munitions, the way we've seen the Ukrainians do, even with relatively constrained budgets. That leads to another element which highlights how Pacific-focused this package arguably is. There is a significant amount of foreign assistance included in this package, almost $1 billion when you total up the assistance as well as funding for training with them. But none of that, despite the war still being a going concern, is for the Ukrainians. Instead, it's an $850 million allocation for military assistance to the forces on the island of Taiwan. That has potential implications not just for the dynamics of the war in Ukraine, but also what part of the US armed services will benefit from that aid. In the case of Ukraine, the lion's share of the equipment replacement funding provided by all of that military assistance has gone to the US Army. Given the very different challenges and strategic circumstances around the Taiwan Strait, imagine the foreign assistance here will likely be a bit more cross-domain. As we get towards the end then, I want to touch on some of the risks and open questions around all of this, because I think it's fair to say that under ordinary circumstances, there'd be a fairly direct causal relationship between the Congress deciding to spend an additional $150 billion on defence, and there being a pretty reliable uptick, to a greater or lesser extent, in defence capabilities. But given everything we've seen from 2025 so far, from trade wars to the increasingly common phenomenon of the assault larder, I think it's fair to say that from an economic and geopolitical perspective, these are not the most ordinary of times. And so if we're trying to project what sort of effect this package of funding might have, there are a couple of risks and open questions on the table. The first is the possibility of supply chain disruptions affecting the defence industry. A major factor here is the ongoing trade war between Washington and Beijing that's seen, among other things, the People's Republic of China start to clamp down on certain critical exports. The US has been working for years to make their defence industry less reliant on China, but less reliant, critically, doesn't mean not at all. And in many cases, the assumed alternative sources for Chinese supplies are in American allied nations, many of whom are also currently engaged in some fairly high-stakes trade negotiations. So risk one is probably that Congress goes ahead and provides the funding to procure specific systems or build up certain capabilities, only for industry to turn around to the Pentagon and say, I'm sorry, we just can't get the inputs. Meaning either A, you're potentially looking at delays, or B, potentially higher costs. That leads to risk two, where a chunk of the additional funding gets chewed up just dealing with inflation rather than actually delivering more output. The US defence industrial base already dealt with some pretty significant inflationary pressures in the early 2020s. They're part of the reason, among other things, that companies like Northrop Grumman did end up losing as much as they did on some of the fixed-price contracts they bid for. And historically, cost inflation in the US military shipbuilding sector has been well above the rate of general inflation. How much risk inflation and cost pressures actually end up posing to some of these critical procurements, only time will tell. But I think the risk is significant enough and the recent experience is painful enough for it to be worth flagging. Assuming that inflation and supply chain risks can mostly be avoided, the next unknown is arguably in the detail of a lot of these provisions. Some of these items relate to investments running into the hundreds of millions or low billions, and yet the description around them might just be a single sentence. How that money actually ends up being deployed and what conditions and requirements are placed around it might play a significant role in how much bang the United States government actually ends up getting for its buck. It's possible to fund industrial scale-ups effectively, but it's also possible to not. So it'll be interesting to see the details of how more of this money is actually used in practice, if and when that information begins to become available. But if it all comes together and a bunch of additional capacity is brought online, the next question is whether the demand is going to be there to effectively use it. Given how backed up the sales pipeline for a lot of these systems is, the answer in the short to medium term at least is probably very much yes. Beyond that, it's likely to be a combination of two interconnected points: future US defence budgets and the consistency of their procurements, and secondly, the foreign sales pipeline, which is particularly relevant, I think, because there is a significant amount of money in this package, which is very internationally focused. There is $250 million for the Defence Exportability Features Program, and another $250 million for international armament cooperation programs. If you think about it, the US is sacrificing an amount of cash that could potentially buy hundreds of high-end long-range missiles in order to bolster its credentials when it comes to international arms cooperation and international arms exports. Under ordinary circumstances, you might expect that that would naturally lead itself to more international programs and greater export successes. With some major clients, especially in Europe, looking to now potentially diversify their sources, I think we can chalk this up as another case of we'll see. Finally, assuming most of this package ultimately passes, I think the final question is, what is the follow-through going to look like? As Germany arguably showed with their €100 billion special fund for the Bundeswehr, a one-off cash injection can deliver significant improvements. In Germany's case, it covered some pretty serious equipment acquisitions. But historically, I'd suggest that successful examples of major military transformations tend to err more towards the China model: predictable, sustained investments with a steady upward curve. In the United States, public polling in favour of increased defence spending is actually at a recent high. And that matches a trend we've also seen generally followed in Europe recently of greater public support for this kind of investment. The issue, though, is that the public is pretty supportive of a whole range of investments. And on the surveys I saw, things like social security and healthcare spending tend to score higher than defence. That suggests that even if Americans might want to see some of these investments made, if it comes down to a trade-off against even more popular programs, things might get politically complicated. The United States has a lot of fiscal firepower, but not an infinite amount. And if economic growth slows or goes negative at a time where the federal government is still running multi-trillion-dollar annual deficits, there may be a risk you don't see the kind of follow-through to all of these investments you'd really need in order to realise the full benefit. This package arguably gives us a bit of a clue about where, to an extent, the military, but to a greater extent Congress, really wants to see the future of the military balance, America's defence industry, and its military capabilities. It's a modernised, more Pacific-centric force that takes new technologies and applies them to an older mission: conventional or nuclear deterrence against peer opponents. This package, if passed it is, would represent a significant step towards building that kind of force. But whether we'll see the follow-up funding necessary to actually get there, only time will tell. And okay, channel update to close out. Obviously, this wasn't originally going to be the topic for this week, but when the announcement was made and the package came out, I had a chance to go through it over the course of the day and pretty quickly decided that it did merit a video, both because of the sheer scale and what it self-signals, and also because it helps build the scaffold, if you like, for two very important future topics, the transformation of the US Army and the transformation of the United States Marine Corps. I don't yet have release dates for either of those videos. The Marine Corps one has been in the cooker for some time, but I do expect both to release sometime in the next couple of months. We spent a lot of time on this channel talking about how rapidly the Ukrainian and Russian militaries are changing and how some other actors, especially those in Europe, are responding to that. But in terms of the sheer amount of money involved and the strategic implications of that, from a defence economics perspective, when the United States starts to make a pivot, I think it's very much worth paying attention. Next week we should be back to the planned regular releases, unless something else dramatic happens somewhere in the world. So, given what we've seen of 2025 so far, let's call it a coin flip. Thank you to those patrons who've been voting in those topic priority polls, and all of you who've watched and engaged with that first patron-exclusive video. I can't guarantee how often those will be releasing, but given the success of the format so far, I would like to do more of them. Cheers, of course, to Odoo for sponsoring this video, and thank you to all of you, as always, for your continuing support and engagement. I do hope you enjoyed the episode, and that I'll see you all again next week.